have y'all here for our author series, which is a collaboration between the Desert Laboratory at Tumamoc Hill, the Southwest Center, and U of A Press. So we're here to hear from Dr. Theresa Crimmins, who is the director of the USA National Phenology Network, and she works enthusiastically to support growth in Nature's Notebook and a broader appreciation of phenology among scientists and non-scientists alike. Theresa is also an associate professor in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment. At the University of Arizona, has published over 80 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Her writing has appeared in Scientific American, The Hill, EOS, Nautilus, Popular Science, and more. And she's had several appearances on NPR as well as PBS, The Weather Channel, and Fox Weather. Her book, Phenology, which will be available for sale and signing after the talk, came out just in time for spring in 2025 through MIT Press. So let us welcome Theresa.
So does it come off, or do I just...
It does. You can pull it up if you want.
Okay.
Powerfully.
Okay. How's that? Good? Good? Okay. Yay, it's spring!
Yay! Watch your head.
Okay, thank you. I probably will bang into it at some point. Thank you. It's spring, and I'm so happy. Have you all seen some signs of spring? What have you seen?
White-winged doves.
Hey, that's a good one. That's a good one, white-winged doves. Anybody been out to see the wildflowers yet? Heck yeah, good. Get out there. It's a good spring. We've seen all sorts of great stuff. It's actually been kind of an interesting season, honestly. So I've been really fortunate to be out on hikes kind of all through the winter and the spring. And these are some of the things that I saw in December. And I captured some of them here because some of them were a little puzzling to me. The Sonoran globe amaranth is on the lower left. Usually we see that late summer, like fall kind of stuff. The mosses were so happy back at that time of year. That is Sabino Canyon, full of water, which was so great to see. And in December, I saw pipevine swallowtails out and multiple tarantulas cruising around, which was interesting. All of that seemed kind of notable to me. And then this is a house in my neighborhood that always screams the announcement for spring for me. Their yard, clearly, is completely full of these African daisies. And usually, I feel like I see them about now, like late February, early March. And this year, I took this picture on February 2nd. And I was like, holy moly, what the heck? And then it kept going. When we went out on our hikes, I started to see all sorts of wonderful friends, usually the typical signs of a good spring that many of us are probably really familiar with, the globe mallow and the California poppy and the trillium 4 o'clocks and the phacelias. And even ones that, I don't know if these are uncommon, but these are ones that I haven't typically seen every spring. Some of the lilies out there, larkspur, the rock hibiscus, which is going crazy right now, and I even got to run into a rather large rattlesnake last Sunday. I think it was a western diamondback, I'm not totally sure. The picture, if you can see it in there, you were doing good. It was really hard to see, but it was there. So what was this all about? Well, why did we have such a strange, muddly mix of all of this interesting stuff happening at strange times of the winter and the spring this year? To really kind of put that together, we've got to back up the truck a little bit, kind of think back to what the weather has been like the last year and a half here, really. So if you guys were here last winter, you might recall it was a really different story. It was actually really, really dry, like disappointingly, painfully dry. This I pulled from the National Weather Service, and I forget which month it's in, but we don't have a laser pointer, do we? Okay, you can hopefully see on the last line, it's at this time, whatever, I think it was in January, they were saying this is second driest winter. And then we kept going, and last summer, I felt like that summed it up pretty well. The monsoon was also similarly very disappointing, very painful. If you got out at all, there were not only not much in flower. Oh,
We know what I do.
thank you so much, you're saving the day.
Yeah.
Okay. The monsoon was really crummy. There were no annuals. There was nothing for anybody to eat. The birds were coming into town that we don't normally see in town, and it was just bad. And then, oh my gosh, it started raining like crazy. And I'll walk you through this plot, but this is a cumulative precipitation starting in October, so that's for the water year. The water year runs October 1st to September 30th, and this is the Tucson International Airport. And so what we've got along the x-axis, oh, I see why we don't use one, is because it doesn't work on the screen. All right, I'll get this back to you. Basically, every blue bar along the bottom there is a precipitation event that we've seen at the airport since October 1st. The red stars that are running from March over is because we haven't had those days of the year yet. And then what the black line that's heading uphill is showing is what the average accumulative precip is normally in a year at that location. And anything that is green means we're ahead of schedule. And so we've been ahead of schedule for precipitation seasonally since the beginning of October, and we are just way ahead. And even if it doesn't rain any more, we're still gonna round out this spring, summer, way ahead of schedule. And so, oh, and there's one more piece of the puzzle. We now have also had the warmest December, the warmest winter on record too. And so those factors combined, dry, super wet, super warm, means all the creatures are like, yay, it's time to get out. And so that's what we're basically seeing now is not only great springtime stuff with all the wildflowers that we usually see in spring, but also this crazy stuff happening in winter that a lot of it is actually carryover from last monsoon. The butterflies, there's a lot of butterflies out, and there were in the winter. And it really, I was checking with some entomological friends, and they were saying these are monsoon friends that are finally getting the moisture that they need to get out there. And the same thing with the tarantulas out there and about too. Unfortunately, there's some downsides to having these great of conditions too. Excuse me. I've been seeing all sorts of large patches of red brome in various places, and of course our best friend, buffalo grass. This was up in the Catalinas a month ago. We came up over a ridge and I was like, oh, this is not great. So that's just the state of things out there in the field right now. And so basically that kind of gets us to where I'm going with this. I'm going to start with what is phenology, because rarely people actually have that word in their everyday lexicon. So we'll start there. And then we're going to talk about, is it changing? And so what? Do we care? And if we do care, is there anything that we can do about it? So I'm going to bring us back to why I just talked you through what the heck's been going on this last winter and spring. Phenology technically refers to when stuff happens seasonally in plants and animals. So it's the when side of these recurring biological events like bloom or leaf out or emergence for insects or egg laying or egg hatch or emergence from hibernation, migratory arrival, migratory departure. And by and large, those events are cued by local conditions. A lot of times temperature plays a role, sometimes day length plays a role, sometimes available moisture plays a role, but you really can't disentangle the when from the why. And so those two pieces combined are really what defines and describes what phenology refers to. So technically it's the study of stuff appearing. The root pheno is Greek for to show or appear, and it's the same root word for phenomenon. And so that's what makes sense to me. It's like phenomenon is a thing happening. Phenology is when that thing happens. And then there's two kind of key ingredients that shape this. There's a very predictable part of things, and then there's a less predictable part of the story. The predictable part is we can pretty confidently know that we're going to have at least something flower in the spring. And we define spring. When we say spring, typically we're thinking of what are the events that characterize spring. And so it's probably, well, I won't use creosote as a good example because creosotes they'll flower anytime there's moisture. But poppies basically are a good harbinger of spring for us here in this season. Why we see poppies in the spring and not other times of the year, or why we see things happen in the spring, is because the Earth is going around the sun. And the fact that we are rotating on an axis that's tilted 23.5 degrees means that we have seasons. It means that when the northern hemisphere is pointing angled towards the sun, we have longer days and warmer temperatures, and when we're at the part of our circumnavigation around the sun, and we're pointed away from the sun, we experience winter. And that doesn't change. This is very, very predictable. And so we know we're going to have warm, longer days at certain times of the year and cool, shorter days at other times of the year. And so stuff will happen predictably as a consequence. But then we have this fabulous thing called an atmosphere, which makes it possible for there to be life on Earth. This is good. It's gases that can contain moisture, make it possible for us to be able to breathe, and protect us from incoming solar radiation. Those things are good. But it makes weather and it makes chaos, basically. This is the part that's not so predictable. The atmosphere organizes itself in these large-scale circulation cells called Hadley cells. And then the fact that we're rotating on that axis on a daily basis makes all sorts of weird things happen, like the jet stream and polar vortices and weather that we can kind of predict, but that we honestly can't really predict. And so it makes it much harder to know exactly what day we'll see those California poppies on. We can kind of say, well, we'll probably see them in the spring, but exactly what day at any given location has everything to do with what those very local conditions have been. And then we've got one more piece layered on top of it. So if we look over the long period of time at any location, if we have a long-term record of when something has happened, we often will see a lot of variability from one year to the next. And so this plot here is from Japan, from Kyoto, Japan, where they have been tracking when the cherry trees flower since the 800s. So we have 1,200 years of uninterrupted observations of when those trees flower, which is pretty incredible. And to my knowledge, is the longest uninterrupted record of any phenological event anywhere on the globe. And so the x-axis is the year, so year running across the bottom, and then the y-axis is when the thing happened in any given year. And so the pink dot, which is maybe kind of hard to see, the pink dots represent the day of year that event happened in a given year. And so we can see, looking through hundreds of years of the record, that it varied from basically late March to early May, and there was a lot of variability. And then someone conveniently put a moving average through the middle, and that's what the jiggly black line is, if you can see it. And basically we have that, lots of variability from one year to the next because of weather, because things vary, because it's complicated. And then we get over here to this mid-1800s, and then the story changes. The dots start going downhill. And basically the trees are progressively, there's still variability. It's still not consistently, you can't predict it from one year to the next, but there is an underlying trend towards earlier flowering. And when we look at global temperatures, that is a pretty strong correlation. So what this plot is global annual average temperatures. It's actually a plot of anomalies, so I'll walk you through that. Basically what our friends at NASA did was look at the globe and figure out across the whole globe for a whole year what was the average annual temperature. And then what they did was they averaged those values between 1951 and 1980. Taking 30 years or 3 full decades is a climatological way of benchmarking things. And so they just, I don't know why, but they took the middle of the last century, they took the climatological average from 1951 to 1980, and then they took the average annual global temperature in each year and differenced that. And so what we're looking at is if the bar for a year is pointing down and is blue, then that year was cooler than that 30-year average period. And if the bar is pointing upward and is in the warm tone, it was a warmer than average year. And basically what we see here is, again, there is variability. There is variability for sure, one year to the next, but there's also a really clear trend toward increasing global temperature. And this plot only goes from 1880 to 2020, which is effectively kind of mid-1800s is when the Industrial Revolution kicked in. And that's when we started pumping CO2 and particulate matter and all this stuff into the atmosphere, and we're continuing to do that. And so as a consequence, the temperatures just keep going. And so we start to see things like that. And that is why phenology is hard to predict. And that is also why phenology has started to make it into, prior to about the 1990s or 2000s, prior to when folks were acknowledging that climate change was a thing or that temperatures in the globe were actually increasing, phenology really was this kind of backwater science. It was largely practiced and observed by folks in the horticultural industry, folks in cooperative extension actually. There was a lot of interest in trying to understand what are the conditions that seem to drive leaf outer flowering so that we can maximize crop production or minimize insect damage, or maybe understand best when to take action to control for really problematic pests. But largely this was not on people's radar. And it was really right around the beginning of the 21st century that a couple of papers came out and documented, actually, we're starting to see stuff like this. Like, uh-oh, these long-term records are showing that stuff is changing, and changing with kind of a pretty consistent pattern that aligns with the temperature. And that's when folks started to really pay attention, honestly. And so, that's where I'm going to talk next. Where I'm going to go next is, so do we see that pattern in other places too that we saw in Japan, or is that an isolated incident? So folks have been keeping track in various ways of phenology basically since we've been on the planet. And what's super cool is that we have some evidence of this dating back like 50,000 years ago in caves in Europe. And it was really only recently, we've known about these cave paintings for a very long time, but it's only been very recently that anthropologists have felt like they have made sense of the kind of the code that's embedded in these. A lot of the cave paintings actually have symbols and markings next to them. You can see the little circles around them with the dashes or dots. And what they believe that these represent are moons, and therefore are kind of like a early calendar indicating when particular events, seasonal events like migration or birthing might be occurring in animals that are of particular importance for food and medicine and shelter. So we've been paying attention and keeping track for a super long time. And some of the other ways that we have evidence of this is in some of the, sometimes it's referred to as lore or information that's passed down through like the Farmer's Almanac, but the sayings, I don't know really the best word for it, but sayings, things like recommendations, I guess. Plant your corn seeds when the oak leaves are the size of a squirrel's ear. I've also heard it be the mouse's ear or another thing. This is a recommendation that's actually rooted in some really serious wisdom that is the result of a lot of trial and error. And what it is encapsulating is you don't want to put your seeds in the ground too early because then they might rot. And you don't want to put your seeds in the ground too late because then you might not have enough time for the plant to mature and produce all of the great crop that you're really after for your survival. And so what indigenous folks back in, this is really born out of the eastern US, recognized was, well, there's kind of this sweet spot that is characterized by when oak leaves are just starting to get bigger. And if you're not from the East, it's a little harder to kind of put that into context. But oaks are not one of the first trees to put their leaves on. They're actually pretty far into the season. There's usually a fairly predictable sequence of when the order that stuff happens in. And in the East right now, I'm hearing reports people are just starting to see crocuses and daffodils poke out of the snow. Not too much longer, they'll start to see things like red maples and birches start to flower, which might sound weird, but they actually do flower. And then oaks are weeks later. They are ones that wait until the risk of frost is pretty much done and the soil is warm enough. It has to do with both temperature, air temperature, and oftentimes soil temperature too. And so if you wait around until the oak leaves are big enough, then you're basically past that risk of frost, and then it's okay to plant your seeds. So this is another indication that folks have been not only paying attention to and documenting, but also implementing information regarding phenology for a really long time. Okay, so how is it changing then? Do we have a good beat on this? Do we have a sense of whether things are changing? It's hard to do that because, and I'll walk you through in a sec, but unless we have good historical records like they do in Japan, it's hard to know whether things have changed, and if so, how much. But there have been some estimates, some attempts in recent years to try to, among various scientists, trying to get their arms around as much data and information as they can from as many different sources and as many different species from as many different locations as possible to try to estimate this. And I know this is a complicated plot, so I'm going to walk through it. What we're looking at here is whether things have changed. And so what the scientists did here was, again, pool data from tons of different studies, and they basically looked to see, has somebody documented that something's changing? So using that cherry blossom record as an example, in that one, you could say, yes, things were changing. If someone ran a trend line through those day of year, you would see that the cherry blossom is advancing. And so what we're looking at here is, these are histograms, meaning how many studies reported a change. And so if we just isolate one of these and look at the bottom one, this is a histogram. This is centered on 0, and then if the studies are captured here with a negative value, that means that the trend showed that the event was advancing. And if it's over here, it means that the trend indicated that the event under consideration was being delayed. And we're looking just at bud burst here. So I'm just showing you the plot for all the plant studies summed up across the whole world in this particular analysis. And what we see is that basically the y-axis, how tall it is how many studies had that magnitude of trend. And so the peak here is just on the left side of 0, which means that the largest proportion of the studies that were evaluated that looked at changes in bud burst said that yes, they are advancing. Bud burst is happening earlier, but just by a few days. And then we had very few, but there were some studies that said they're advancing by up as much as 30 days. But then we also had a lot of studies that showed that things were delaying and some things that were delaying by a huge amount. So it's a very complicated story. And then the colors, what that represents is how many years were in the record, because sometimes we have only 10 years of data, sometimes we have 1,200 years of data, that's rare, that's the Japan one. So the darkest color is the shortest amount of years in the study, and then it progressively, sorry, I got that wrong. The lightest color is the shortest years, and the darkest colors is the longest. And so the fact that the peak basically lines up here means that it doesn't really matter how long the record is, we still see the largest proportion of studies show an advancement. But also the takeaway is it's a very mixed bag. Some are advancing by a huge amount, some are just by a little, and a whole lot are actually delaying. And that's just bud burst. Then when we keep going up, the pattern continues. And actually, if you look at the point of the peak, as we progress, so the authors were saying this is basically the sequence that plants undergo over the course of the season. And what we see is that we continue to see the bulk of studies showing a advancement in the timing, and that peak shifts to the left. And so effectively what they were arguing is that it's basically a compounding effect over the course of the season, where the first event advances. The second event advances even more because the first one was advanced, and then the subsequent one advances even more because of the history behind it that season. And so what we've got is, and then fruiting does something different. And so effectively what this complicated plot is showing is that globally, it's kind of a muddle. We've got all sorts of things going on, and it's not a neat story at all. And then when we start to just look at our country and what's going on, this is another way that we can kind of characterize stuff. This is showing the trend from 1981 to 2025, so just the last 45 years, whether the start of spring is advancing or delaying. And in this plot, the green shows that things are moving earlier. The conditions associated with the beginning of biological activity are shifting earlier. And if it's tan, we're seeing a delay. The tan is hard to see on here. There's a little bit of tan up in the very top of North Dakota and Montana and Minnesota, but because temperatures are doing something weird up there. But largely we see advancement, or not a lot of change, but largely it's advancement. And what's interesting is, again, it's very highly variable across space. And so that's, again, what we see is that there's so much variation among species and among locations as to what's going on, and the time of the event and everything else too. Okay, so what were some of the sources of the data that went into that meta-analysis that I showed you the plot, where they tried to wrap their arms around everything else? How can we look back in time if we haven't been purposefully keeping track of stuff? We have to get kind of creative, actually. And some of the best studies that we have been able to draw some of those insights from are things like people's journals. Sometimes people have taken really, really good records of what they've seen happen at their homestead or on their property or on their farm, And those records are good enough that we can look back to them and then resample, basically go back to that location and repeat those observations and look to see if things have changed. Satellites can be a good source, but they're relatively short in record. They really only came online late 60s, early 70s, so we have a few decades there. Personal observations, which I'll get to because the program that I lead has a really important project that involves people in that. And then one other source of data that I'll walk through is herbarium records. This is such a cool and perhaps unexpected source of data. So herbarium specimens are preserved plant specimens that were collected for other reasons. They were the kinds, this is the kind of thing that like Darwin collected when he was out doing his sailing around the world, and Humboldt and some of the other explorers. They would take samples of plants and then press them, smash them down, both to make them flat and travel better, and to preserve them. And we retain those because they give a lot of information on, they were first important for just knowing what was where and trying to document what are new species. And then more importantly, we still use those, we still collect them now so that we can understand plants' distributions, and they can now be sampled even for their DNA, for further analysis of how much things vary across space. And they're just really good records of when and where things were at various times. The really cool bit about them, though, is that they always have a card on the bottom here, which says who collected it, where it was collected, and when it was collected. And the great thing about them is that one of the kind of basic principles of herbarium specimens is to collect as many of the structures as you can, because very often it's the flowers and the fruits and all those special features that help distinguish distinct species. And so oftentimes when you pull a specimen, it'll look like this. It'll have flat flowers or flat fruits, if it can. Sometimes there's a little envelope with the seeds tucked into it. Sometimes not, some plants don't lend themselves to it, like saguaros are really not good for herbarium. But there are billions of these around the globe, and many of them have not even been digitized. And largely they're just being scanned and kept in databases so that people can, again, know what was when, where. But the fabulous thing is that if we can pull the information about whether the plant was flowering, and we know where and when that happened, that's a phenology record. We now know that particular species was in flower at that location on that day, maybe 150 years ago or more, because a lot of herbarium specimens are very old. Yay! Yes! So, we'll have fun here and then walk you through a couple of really quick examples. Findings emerging from herbarium specimens are like, we're just starting to nibble at the edge. I don't know what proportion of herbarium specimens have been digitized, but it's somewhere in the 20% range globally. And then whether they've had that further bit of information about the phenological status documented is even smaller. There's some massive efforts underway to extract all that information and start to put it in databases. So we are on the edge of seeing all sorts of amazing stuff. But here's a really cool example of some historical data that some folks unearthed unexpectedly not too long ago, because sometimes we have this happen too. Back in the early 1800s, there was a guy named Simeon DeWitt who had this idea. He wasn't the first, he was among folks at that time who were like, we need to get some weather stations out across these states, these new states, this new country that we have. Because you know what, the weather doesn't behave the way it does in Europe like we thought it would, and the plants don't grow the way we thought they would in Europe, and we really need to better understand this. And there had been efforts since Thomas Jefferson and even earlier to try to get more instrumentation out across the states. Things were not standardized as to which temperature scale they were using, much less the instrumentation. And it was really expensive. All the thermometers and the hygrometers, some of it didn't even exist yet. And it was very expensive. So what they realized, they did notice, well, plants are good integrators of weather conditions. So maybe we should observe the plants instead. And so Simeon DeWitt, who was the Surveyor General of the state of New York at the time, so a relatively influential guy, was like, I know, we will get all these academic institutions all across the state of New York to keep track of when these different species of common trees and bushes, shrubs that they had on the properties of the institutions, when they leaf out and when they flower. And if we can get that all across the country, or sorry, all across the state, we can start to get a sense of what is the climate like across this large area, because we have the influence of Lake Erie and the ocean, and there's elevation, and can we predict this at all? So here was their original map, which I think is so cool. This is from some document from the 1850s. The arrows show the locations of all the institutions, and then this is a better map, actually, of the locations. The black dots are all the locations where institutions collected observations for decades, from 1826 through, at some of the locations, through the 1870s, though the Civil War did kind of wreck a lot of it. But a lot of it was also transferred over to the Smithsonian Institute once it was set up at this time, and then they actually extended the whole effort to many more states for just a period of about 6 years in the 1850s. And so we have some really cool historical records of phenology, of leaf out and flowering from that part of the country in that part of of history. And just recently, like in less than 10 years ago, all those data were bound up in annals and then forgotten. And somebody who was really interested in history in New York found them and realized that they might be a good source of data. And I could do a whole talk on just this, honestly, but the long story short is he reached out, found someone else who I have collaborated with, and we said, well, hey, we actually have a bunch of data on those same species in basically the same locations. So the white dots on this map are all contemporary observation locations of the same species that we happen to have people out observing, and we were able to compare data for the observations of leaf out and flowering for 36 different species of plants, and comparing from the 1800s to present, here's what we saw. And so the change in flowering time is on the left, and the change in leaf out is on the right. And I'm sorry that these are only Latin names, but I can translate for you. But basically, the colors represent the functional type, whether it was a leaf or a tree, a shrub, or a forb meaning a little flowery thing. And we've got oaks and tulip tree and maples and dogwood and several of them. The take-home point, though, the main point here is that all the bars only go in one direction, which means things are advancing. And they, in some cases, advanced by a huge amount. Liriodendron tulipifera is tulip tree. It showed a change, an advancement of nearly a month between the early 1800s and present day, which is kind of mind-boggling to me, because I grew up in Michigan, and I love tulip tree, and I think of it as a late May, early June, kind of like start of summer flowering tree. And that's what I just thought it did. It varied from year to year, but it was the start of summer. But it probably used to flower a whole month later than that, and I had no idea, and I think probably no one else knew that either. So finding those historical records can be incredibly insightful for helping us understand whether things have changed. And then there was a couple more cool insights that we had from that. Because we had the 36 different species, we were able to compare whether we saw differences between more urban areas or rural, and probably not surprising, there were greater advancements in the more urban areas, largely because it's warmer and there's a lot more artificial light, which seems to play a really important role in getting plants to do their thing. We also saw greater advancements in the insect-pollinated plants versus the wind-pollinated, which is a good thing if the insects are also shifting the timing of their activity. We also saw a greater advancement in the early season stuff, which is a pretty common pattern. Usually the stuff that comes out first is the most sensitive to temperature, and so if temperature increases, then those guys tend to shift things by a greater degree. And then kind of interestingly, trees were the more sensitive ones than the shrubs or the forbs, which to me was surprising. Okay, here's a cool example of somebody's journal. You might have heard of Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau is a really good poster child for this. I want to talk about someone else because this woman doesn't get all the attention, but she did something just as cool. This was a woman who in Massachusetts, I think it's Massachusetts, was just an extremely engaged conservationist. She was an educator and the first head of I didn't write it down, the Audubon Society, I think, in chapter in that state. And she also happened at her farm to keep track of, for over 40 years, when she first saw different birds, flowering plants, butterflies, and amphibians sing at her property. And some researchers in that part of the country found her data and decided, hey, let's just pull them from her journals and put them into spreadsheets and see if this can actually tell us anything useful. And what they found was, first off, over that period from 1970 to the early 2000s, the temperature increased substantially. This is mean annual temperature. And then when they looked at some of the events, they saw really clear trends that seemed to walk right alongside them. And this particular one, I didn't write it down. This is one of the birds. A couple of the birds showed the greatest advancements in the timing of their arrival, but then she also showed there was also a clear change in several of the other things that she had looked at. I just find that so cool because she did this out of love for the nature, but then it turned out that what she had done was a really good record that we can use now to refer back to how things have changed. And then one more, going back to the herbarium records, because there are, like I said, lots of cool studies coming out of this. This is one out of Canada where they pulled more than 17,000 specimens for over 9,000 plant species, and this plot is showing all of the different trend lines over time. Again, this is year, and it starts at 1900 on the left side here and goes through present day, basically. And what we're looking at is across Canada, did things seem to shift earlier or later? And you can see actually that's it's kind of a mess. It looks like pickup sticks. The key take home here is it's the length of the growing season has gotten more compressed. We have a lot more synchronicity or compression in when all these different species are now seen in flower than we used to, which actually can be problematic for pollinators if they're looking for resources at more of the tails of the season. That's just one kind of tiny little peek of the kind of stuff that we could get out of herbarium records, and there have been some really neat studies coming out of that. And if you want to know more about how things are changing, I actually do cover a lot of it in the book. And I just threw in one slide for animals. There's so much more to go on here, but I did want to pull this out because it's also a really good example. It's a good example of how things have changed and a really cool example of, again, kind of maybe unexpected sources of data. This comes out of Narragansett Bay. The University of Rhode Island has a boat that they take out into the bay every week and sample. They basically do I think it's a trawler? I don't know. I'm not a boat person. I'm not an aquatic person. But they sample basically what fish are present in the bay every single week. And they've been doing this since the 1950s, basically without interruption. So it's a crazy good record. And so some researchers decided to just look at what species are present, and it was phenomenal what they reported. I had to go back to the study like 3 times to make sure I got the numbers right, because so what it is the temperature, the water temperature changes over the course of the year because of ocean currents. And the fish follow the currents because they have a thermal tolerance. They need to either have it be warm enough or cool enough. And so there are different fish that hang out in the bay in the winter and in the summer. And because of things getting warmer and their ocean currents changing, it's a lot warmer for a lot longer. And so we see those summertime residents now I have the dates, I have the information, I'm not getting that right. The summer residents remain between 30 and 80 days longer now, and that's fish like scup and butterfish and summer flounder. And then the winter fish are there. This guy is he's the most emblematic. Longhorn sculpin has shortened his wintertime stay since the 1950s by 118 days. And he's not the only one. Red hake, ocean pout, and winter all have their winter stays like 3 months shorter than they used to be. So that just blew my mind because I always think, oh, the water is more buffered. We'll probably see the biggest changes in terrestrial stuff. And I was floored, not being an aquatic person, when I started to look into phenology changes in marine and aquatic systems. Okay, whoops. Okay, so why does this matter? We care for ecological reasons, for sure, honestly. there's a lot of actually economic reasons why it matters if phenology is changing as well. And we're starting to see some of this evidence and we're going to start feeling it in our pocketbooks too, honestly. One of the big ones that folks are very concerned about is emerging mismatches between species that interact. And plants and their pollinators are one of the biggest. Stands to have really important economic impact because we need our crops to be pollinated. What is it, like every third bite of food is that you should thank a bee for it because the bees play such an important role in pollination. The trick is it's hard to actually pinpoint evidence of mismatches occurring, and researchers kind of stress and strain and stretch to do this, but the fact that we already are in this situation where we have far, far, far fewer insects out in the world, just we have fewer of them, if they're also shifting the timing or they're not shifting and the plants that need them to for that pollination service, it can become a problem. And so folks in the ag industry are paying close attention to this one. Definitely risk of false springs is a problem. Fall spring is where it gets really warm really early in the year and the plants and the animals start to respond, and then the weather is like, just kidding, it's still winter. And then you get a hard freeze. And this is happening at increasing frequency with some really devastating consequences. In 2012, we had the warmest, record-breaking warmth in the upper Midwest, all sorts of records broken in the Chicago and Michigan and Ohio area very early in the year, like in February. And then an April frost event came. And the warmth had been sustained long enough that a whole lot of plants came out of their winter hibernation. And there's a lot of fruit trees in that part of the country that flower before they leaf out. Trees are really frost tolerant until they start putting out those tender new tissues. And if those tender new tissues happen to be flower blossoms, those guys get hammered if there is a sub-zero event. And if you hit all your flowers, you're not going to have fruit. And so that event alone caused $500 million worth of damage to the cherry crops in Michigan that year. And unfortunately, the frequency of that kind of sequence of very early, warm, sustained enough to kind of trick plants to come out of their winter hibernation, and then just a normally timed freeze event to occur after, that's becoming a lot more concerning. Also, I'm sorry to keep telling you bad news, but allergy season has totally gotten longer. And it's basically because things are warmer, so plants are starting to flower earlier, and then they just keep on flowering. And then they are even actually extending later into the fall too, or later at that tail end of the season, depending on which group it is. There's been numerous studies now that have shown that all across the country we're seeing, just since the 1990s, we're seeing a pollen season that's 3 weeks longer than it used to be, and there's more pollen in the air. So if you feel like your allergies are worse, you're not imagining it, it's really true. And then another consequence of shifting phenology that you might not think about, but actually can be kind of economically impactful, is shifting mismatches between festivals and other events, and when that event that they're supposed to be celebrating actually happens. And I experienced this a lot. My parents used to live in Holland, Michigan, which is this lovely little town on the West Michigan lakeshore, settled by folks from the Netherlands. They plant tons and tons and tons of tulip bulbs in the fall. Tons of retirees flock there in the spring. It's supposed to be in May, first couple of weeks in May. People book their hotels a year in advance. Huge tourism draw. And there's been a whole lot of years lately where the tulips come up early, then there's a bunch of wind, all the petals get blown off, and by the time people come, it's stem time. And so the city of City of Holland actually shifted the timing of the Tulip Time Festival. They moved it 2 weeks earlier, I think, about 10 years ago, to try to better match the event with, because they're planning a year or more out in advance, and you can't know what's going to happen, a spring 2 years out. So, and another good example, this time of year, usually I get a lot of phone calls from folks in the DC area saying, hey, what's going to happen with the cherry blossoms? And I haven't had a single inquiry yet, and it's because it's been really cold there. They've had a crazy cold winter, crazy cold spring, nothing's happening. And I just checked the Park Service there at the Tidal Basin does their own predictions, as does the Capital Weather Gang with the Washington Post. everybody's saying later this year. Hopefully you didn't book your hotel room to be at the early front of it like you should have the last several years, because this year it's a slow behind year. And then finally, we can have a mixed bag in terms of other kinds of implications. If we have a longer growing season, there are some good things that can come out of that. We can see a longer period of shade in, say, urban trees, or potentially more carbon sequestration. As long as leaves are on the trees, they're sucking carbon dioxide out of the air, turning it into carbohydrates, plant parts, and putting some of it in the ground, so that's a good thing. Though it is complicated, because if we have a situation where it's a fall spring where the plants put on their leaves early, then they get hammered by frost, that knocks them back, and then they can't be photosynthesizing that whole time that they're trying to put the leaves back on. So it's not an easy slam dunk story to say like, oh, earlier springs are good because they're going to sequester more carbon. It's complicated. But the longer that we have leaves on trees, there are benefits for sure. Okay, so we kind of have this sense now. Phenology is changing, and it matters. So are we doing a better job now of keeping track of it? In other countries, they have been. In other continents, they've done a really good job. Again, like Japan, also Europe, also China, also that's about it. Here in the States, we kind of started to get our act together after the early 2000s studies started to roll in. There were a few folks here in the country that had been beating this drum for a while, and in 2007, the USA National Phenology Network was finally established, and it was a collaborative project between the University of Arizona and the US Geological Survey. And it's been always based here at the U of A. It traditionally was funded by the USGS up until 2020, and then things got complicated. That's a different story. But the aim of the organization is basically to keep track of when stuff happens in plants and animals, to make that information freely available to support our better understanding of what's going on and how it's changing, to support real-time decision-making, things like when should we get out and try to treat that buffalo grass, when is it greening up, when should we put out pesticides for particular really problematic pests, like especially in the east, but here too now, emerald ash borers or spotted lanternflies. Communicate and connect. We really try to just help people understand what phenology is and why it matters, and how it's a really, really good indicator of how conditions are changing and how plants and animals are responding. And then we're trying to make sure that the work that we do is benefiting everybody here in the country. So the one big thing that we do, one of the big things, is to run this platform called Nature's Notebook. So if you don't know about it, this is your chance to get involved if you're interested. It is an app. It's basically an app. You can do it on the computer too, but the intention is that you go out and make repeated observations of what you see happening over the course of the season on particular plants or animals in a location. It's the core of it is these standardized observation protocols, because the intention is to generate data that are of sufficient rigor and quality that they can be used in science and decision making. And so for that reason, it's not the kind of platform where you can just make an observation on any old species. We actually are kind of prissy about it, and we're like, these are the species that you can observe. However, we do take requests if you have things you feel very strongly about. And then we really put a lot of effort into trying to provide support and training so that folks can feel like they know what they're doing, and also build community and be a part of something cool. And so I won't go into this, but we have really extensive functionality to either participate as an individual, like in your backyard, or as part of a group, like at a botanical garden, or there's more locations all the time where groups of folks are observing across the country. And then very soon, like by the end of the month, but I'm still not allowed to say the date because the team is not comfortable with me saying, we're gonna have a wholly new app. So if you use it right now, you'll know that it's kind of dull and kind of, it gets the job done, but it won't like cheer you on or make you excited. The new app has so much more better functionality and is just so much better suited for onboarding new people and for folks that have never said the word phenology. And so if you do currently use it, once we're comfortable with the new version, you'll get prompted in your app to download the new one. If you don't yet do it, you can either hang out for a few more months or a few more weeks and then download it, or you can go ahead and download it and then it'll get prompted, or you can just sign up for our newsletters and you'll know either way. That app, though, Nature's Notebook, has existed since 2009, and so since that time we have amassed 45 million records, which that's the density of the data across the country, and so every circle on the map is a location where data have come in, and the size of the circle is how much. And those data have been used in well over 200 peer-reviewed science publications and assessment reports and dissertations and master's theses and all sorts of cool stuff. I'm just going to give you one example because 200 is too many, but this is one of my favorite examples. These researchers out of the University of Kentucky noticed that poplar, which is one of the plants that is wind pollinated and so maybe creating pollen that's problematic for your allergies, is shifting the timing of its flowering earlier in the year. That's been well documented in other studies. And they noted too, it's something called a dioecious plant, which means that the male and female flower parts are on separate trees, which is kind of a rare strategy for flowering plants. It's only about fewer than 10% of flowering plants actually invoke dioecious, I don't know how I should say it, have totally separate male and female plants. Since they're wind pollinated, it's kind of imperative that they both flower at the same time because they are relying on the wind to get the pollen from the male plant all over through the wind and swirl around and land into the female flower. So that's kind of tricky. So the researchers were like, hey, let's see, are the male and female trees advancing flowering time at the same rate? Because if they're not, we might be in trouble. And then secondly, if you look at this picture, there's no leaves yet. There's a teeny tiny leaf at the top of the male flower. That's a strategy, again, that's helpful here because if you're relying on the wind to get your pollen to blow from the male to the female flower, you don't want leaves getting in the way. And so there's this other bit where they're wondering, is the advancement in the flowering time going to get impeded by leaves? Are we basically going to see a greater advancement in the timing of leaf out than flowering? And so they asked both of those questions using data contributed by Nature's Notebook observers all across the country who were tracking poplars without any knowledge that these data may be used in this way. They were just like, hey, we're going to observe our trees because it's cool and we'll see what happens. And what they found was, when we look at the flowering time of the male and the female plants and whether they're changing, they found that the male plants are advancing to a greater degree than the female plants. So we are seeing a temporal separation beginning to emerge, which is kind of a bad thing. It's not so bad that they're not overlapping anymore, but we are starting to see it split apart. But then, when we look at the flowering versus leaf out, we also see a spreading apart where the flowering is shifting earlier at a greater rate than the leaf out is. They're both shifting, but that's shifting greater. So that's a good thing. And so if we can minimize the impeding of the leaves and those two don't separate so much so that they're not overlapping at all, maybe they'll be okay. But this is the kind of thing that the data can be used to investigate, one of just so many examples. And these researchers are now extending this to other species that use this same strategy, like spicebush and I forgot the other one now. Anyway, they're expanding their study. And so one of the things that we do is, and almost anytime a study that uses our data is published, we try to write it up in a little public-friendly summary, which we call publication summaries, which are on our website. And so that's an example of that one. So if you're interested in knowing any of that, you can check those out on our website. And again, if you sign up as an observer, you will automatically get newsletters that tell you all of this and direct you to it. But just want to mention that we cover that. One other thing is next week is astronomical spring. March 20th is the official astronomical start of spring when we get to spring equinox. And so we're celebrating, we always celebrate, well, this is our 4th year, I think, celebrating Phenology Week that week. And that is, there will be a series of events that are virtual. They're all virtual because since we're national in scope, we have to just do stuff virtual. But there's all sorts of cool stuff on there. And I put the URL, but if you're interested, you can just go to usaN.org and scroll down because there's a news block at the end of the page that tells you all this. And if you go to the website, you can scroll to the very bottom and there's that link for signing up for the newsletters too, so that you can learn about all these things. And so, thank you so much for hanging in there. In summary, the timing of seasonal events is shaped largely by environmental factors. The conditions and the phenology are changing. Temperatures are getting warmer, other stuff's getting scrambly, phenology is changing, and there's a lot of consequences for ecological functioning and economic impacts. The more we understand how things are changing, the better we can anticipate that and make changes or adapt, either ecologically or in how we make decisions. And ultimately, more data, more observations on the ground is what we need to be able to better understand that. So that's an invitation to join Nature's Notebook. And thank you. Here's a whole bunch of stuff. So can I take questions if there are any? Okay, I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any. Yeah.
I have a quick comment first, which is that I recently got into plants for the first time, and you guys put out a botany primer, and I've looked at a few different resources, and it's by far the best introduction to plants that
Thank
I've
you.
found. And then my question is, do you make a distinction between biological phenology and what you might call geophysical phenology?
Yes.
They're so closely interrelated. I'm wondering, is it just per study how you decide to bring them together, or how do you think about that?
Oh, are you asking whether so first thing I thought of.
Something that what makes me think about it is like precipitation, so closely linked. So what happens in our biology? So you can't really talk about one without the other.
Yeah.
But they're
So
two.
do we provide that information as you're asking?
Yeah, they're two very different types of data. So I guess
Yeah.
how do you think about integrating them?
So if largely when folks want to analyze the data, typically they hold those kind of parameters on their own. Temperature or precipitation or day length can be calculated based on latitude and day of year. But to shortcut it for folks to be able to explore and just try to begin to understand those kinds of patterns, we do, I say this with a caveat, but we do, when you download the phenology data, we do append some seasonal summary data. So seasonal meaning we use the climatological definitions. So December, January, February is winter, and March, April, May is spring. That's what climatologists, that's how they define the seasons. And we include seasonal average temperatures and seasonal precipitation totals for the year that those events were observed. I say there's a caveat though, because the source of data that we had pinned basically hitched our cart to is something called DayMet, which is like super duper out of date. Like they take like a whole year to release their data, and then it got even way more lagged when the government shut down. So I'm trying to get us to pivot to something else called Prism, but it's not a simple thing to do. So right now, if you go to try to look at that climate data, it's a little, it's just there's null values in all the 2025 and 26 observations. And I'm hoping that later this summer we will address that. But yeah, we kind of do that just to give folks a place to start. And if you, I don't know if you've messed around in our visualization tool, but you can plot things. You can look at like, is there a relationship between winter temperature and leaf out in red maples? That's what that is pulling. But yeah, usually analysts, researchers, if they're going really deep, they know what they want and they do it on their own, and that's fine.
Yeah. And on that map with the green and tan, like I noticed Arizona was quite white. Are there some areas that are geophysical buffers that sort of allow for things to stay more the same?
You talking about this one right here?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this guy, this is hard to talk about. The data underlying this is effectively a thermal accumulation model, meaning it works a whole lot better in the eastern US. Basically, in places where there's distinct seasonality, where plants and animals go dormant in the winter, then largely what gets them going in the spring is the days getting longer and then largely the temperature getting warmer. And what they're paying attention to is not just temperature on any one day, but usually kind of aggregating and synthesizing that temperature over a long period. And one way to kind of keep track of that is something called growing degree days, which people in ag use a lot. But this model is actually even more fine-tuned for phenology because plants in particular, the plants that it's based on is lilacs and honeysuckles. And what we know is that they actually have mechanisms internally where it's not just any old temperature that matters. They give basically bonus points for big warm synoptic events. So if you're in southern Michigan and it's been cold and cold and cold, and then you get a warm front come through and for like 3 days it's 70 degrees, that counts a lot more toward pushing plants into doing something than just kind of like a trickle of warmish days for many days. So this model basically is characterizing when does a location reach those conditions, those thermal conditions where things will just start happening. And then what this is a trend of when that happens. But here in Arizona, it's a different story. We don't really have that nice, neat winter where everything goes to sleep and we're buried in snow and it's cold and nothing's happening. We have the opposite, where it's a total muddle. And like in December, I was seeing monsoon stuff and spring stuff. Monsoon stuff really late, spring stuff really early, because we had just crazy, complicated conditions. And so this model, we operationalize it for this part of the country, but it's less biologically relevant. It'll just tell you more about, have we seen changes in the temperature conditions? I hope that helps. I could do a whole hour-long talk on that too. Yeah.
So I was thinking about the phenological changes in differences in latitude, global latitude, and how that might balance out.
Yeah.
Depending on the landmass and the different latitudes. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So largely we are of course data limited, but one of the kind of nice neat things that I can say about this is that the Arctic areas are warming at a much faster rate than temperate systems, and so we are seeing much more rapid rates of advancement in really high latitudes. Those are some of the places that really caused the alarm bells to start ringing back in the late 90s and early 2000s, because Arctic plants were just doing crazy things. And actually that's some of the places where we have the best evidence of mismatches documented as well, between migrating caribou and the availability of young leaves being present for when the moms are giving birth and the baby caribou need to eat those leaves. And that has actually been documented pretty well, where we're starting to see major population declines in some of those species as a consequence of just stuff changing so fast and at different rates and just becoming decoupled. So yeah, and then kind of at the opposite end, tropical systems, when we're talking about like equatorial regions, that's so much more, you actually really kind of get into aseasonal environments in some places there. And it's so much more about, well, is there a rainy season or is there no seasonality at all? And it's more complicated there because the rainfall patterns aren't necessarily showing clear trends the way global temperatures are. And so stuff is just less straightforward there too. So yeah, it's complicated. It's far more complicated than I ever thought it would be when I got into this.
Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
Great talk. I was wondering what your thoughts are on mechanisms being so variable with the end of season dates. Like you showed the histogram plot from the meta-analysis where the autumn senescence was like, there was no change and it was highly variable, where there was like that strong trend in the spring dates.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering why that might be the case, or what your thoughts are on that, because I know there's a lot of different hypotheses as to why autumn's so different.
Yeah, I'm going to say the same thing. It's a lot messier. Even in temperate systems, we can tell this relatively straightforward story where in the spring, pretty much warm temperature plays such a dominant role. Plants might also care a bit about how cold it's been in the winter or how many hours of day length it is, but still temperature rules the day. But for the tail end, for the shutdown of photosynthesis and leaf senescence and that kind of stuff, it's not done. We've not figured it out. It seems like there's chilling, basically the opposite, as days start to cool down seems to play a role, and days shortening seems to play a role, but available moisture also does. And so we're starting to see, in some studies they're showing an extension where, if you keep having warm days, things just hang on longer. But then we're also starting to run into certain places where if you start to have midsummer drought, that can stress the trees enough to cause them to drop their leaves right then and there. And then that actually looks like an earlier leaf drop situation. And then, I didn't even get into this, but the artificial light is really muddling things up too. Phytochromes are fascinating, honestly, and whether it's a long day plant or a short day plant, and what extended light does to those different things is different. So that's I always get uncomfortable when it's fall and reporters start calling me because I'm like, I don't really know. It's harder. And all of those things can really disrupt not only the timing, but the brilliance of the color too. And that's what people really care about is, well, where are we gonna see good colors? And the cascade of things that are happening at the molecular level that lead to the brilliant golds or the reds are different and are being impacted in different ways too. So I'm just gonna wave my hands around a bit and say, I don't know. Any other? Yeah.
I'm a little afraid to ask questions because of the answers I might get. You're talking about phenological shifts in plants, which is mostly like the base of the trophic system. And obviously all of these shifts are going to have cascading effects across predator-prey dynamics.
Absolutely,
Interaction webs. Like, I just feel like there's so many confounding variables in trying to predict what that's going to look like that, like, I don't even know how you try to do it, but are people modeling that? And what are some of the concerning
it's
things
such a
we
good
might
question. There's some really good data that has come out of the UK where they have better records. There's just a much better, ethos for keeping track of stuff in Europe than there has been here in the US. And so there's some really good multi-trophic studies, long-term monitoring that comes out of there. And yes, what they tend to show, again, this is just what I remember, and it's just for the UK, so it's just specific to that system, but we do see the greatest shifts in the plants, which are the primary producers, and then the things that eat the plants are shifting, but to not as much of an extent, and then the animals that eat the animals are shifting even less, and so, yeah, it does start to look like a breakdown in the system. But again, it's complicated because some species are specialists and some are generalists, and sometimes things can reshuffle. Again, what I'm remembering is that it was really confusing when they looked at the aquatic stuff. So it's a really open question, I would say.
I guess I'm wondering, when they model it, do they see things that, like, wow, if this and this happens, are there like certain tipping point sort of things that they see?
Yeah, I don't know that we've gotten that sophisticated, other than like single species in single locations. Being able to do it across huge areas of a lot of species we're data poor, honestly. So I feel like, again, that's honestly why in Nature's Notebook we invite folks to observe on both plants and animals, because even though we're not explicitly tracking species interactions, we're trying to set up the ability to do that. One of the biggest requests we've gotten over the years from observers is, I'm looking at this plant and I see a bee on it. Do you want me to tell you that? And we're like, actually, yeah, that would be awesome. And so we're trying to figure out how to, right now, I don't know if any of you are iNaturalist folks, but we get this question all the time. Can I take pictures in some minimum to iNaturalist? So that's one of the many features that's getting added to the new app, is that, yes, you will be able to do that, because the iNaturalist, if you're not familiar, is a platform where you can take a picture of something, even if you don't know what it is. And what it does is you're basically providing photo documentation of something happening, again, kind of like an herbarium specimen, but a digital one. This thing was in this place at this time, and now we can mine those photos we can first of all figure out what the species are, and then extract the phenology. Yeah.
There's and on that note, my second question was actually about iNaturalist. Are you guys familiar with how, because they do have a phenology component on there,
Yeah.
and how much of that data can you tap into with your app or your program to already get that kind of data?
That is excellent question.
Yeah.
Excellent question. Okay, so if you're not familiar with iNaturalist, it's the app that I just described, where you don't have to know at all what you're looking at. You just point your phone at the thing, take the picture, it goes into the database, and then this fabulous community of people help you figure out what it is. And then yes, there are so many additional fields that you optionally can fill out about the thing that you're photographing. And there are a couple of phenology fields too, like if it's a plant, is it in flower? Does it have leaves? We have worked behind the scenes with folks from their team to try to get our protocols aligned, so that if you're making those documentations in their system, they match ours. And then there are also some efforts underway and just starting to come online where those data can be combined. So yes, researchers are just starting to do that, and yeah, it is really, the iNaturalist has orders of magnitude more observations for obvious reasons. It's just a very different kind of system than ours, and so they're just basically they're effectively presence observations, but you can extract phenology, so they're presence observations of phenology, like again, like herbarium. That plant was in flower on that day at that place. We don't know when it wasn't in flower, but we know it was in flower there. You still can do an awful lot with that. And so folks are just starting to like literally scratch the surface on that too.
Yeah, I didn't know if your technical language between the two programs was compatible, so.
We're working on it. Yeah, a lot is gonna come online soon. And also I think that once our new app goes live and you can send, from within Nature's Notebook, deploy your camera, take a picture, and have it sent to iNaturalist, and they will be linked. The records between the two platforms' databases will be linked. I think that'll just boost us both. It'll be really cool.
Bless those data.
Yeah, I know. So the trick is here now, we gotta make sure that we can continue to convince our lawmakers that these programs are worth funding. That's the challenge. I won't go into the details, but we had been federally funded for a really long time, and that kind of crumbled, and thankfully we have foundation funding now, but it's hard, it's really hard, so.
I think you went the whole talk without saying climate change, so good job.
I said global warming a lot. Yeah, I saw a question over here.
So to that question, how would you respond, like a devil's advocate, I make the argument that we have more people looking at gathering phenological data than we ever have before. We should see things earlier, even if they're not shipped.
That's a
We
good
looked
question
at
too,
this
yes.
earlier.
I wish I had a blackboard. Oh, I do have a blackboard.
Might say that's,
Yes.
it looks like things earlier. 'Cause there's more
You're
information.
so right. You're basically saying this right here, that if you have, if this is time, and this is how many observations, if we have a smaller population and it's a Gaussian distribution for when that thing is happening, your first record is, whoops, gonna be there. And if you have more that you're observing, you're gonna capture it earlier. You're totally right. You're totally right. So when people are analyzing data, they've gotta account for that, honestly. The good thing about the papers and the studies that we're looking at here is that they do undergo rigorous peer review, and so that's kind of one of the things that reviewers are supposed to look for and catch. And so, yeah, anybody can download the data and do whatever they want with it, and we don't police that in any way, shape, or form. But thankfully, the scientific field, the field of science and that peer review is supposed to be that kind of like check on errors like that. That's actually a pretty classic one in phenology. So great question. There's another one over here. Yeah.
I'm thinking about annuals, and whether they can essentially change gears within a season. So you have good rains, kind of winter, and then it was dry, and all these little lupins come up, and they're little microplants.
Yeah.
They're about ready to bolt and flower and grow. But we just got an inch of rain the other day, and I'm wondering if they're gonna shift gears and say, well, maybe I can grow a little longer, or what?
Yeah, I don't know.
Stuff like that? Or just bolt and die?
I don't know enough about lupin to answer that question. What I can say is that I know in these highly variable environments like what we're in right now, a lot of annuals do have that built-in mechanism where if they think they are experiencing drought and they've already invested resources in growing, they oftentimes will panic and flower when they're still really small. Because they're like, shoot, that's the whole point here, is complete the life cycle. So I've seen, and even lemon lovegrass, which is a perennial, but I studied it for my dissertation, I would see it flower when it was this tall, and in good years it's this tall. So annuals invoke that same strategy, but I don't know, you're describing the alternate of like, hey wait, stop flowering, go back to growth. It's internal, hormones and stuff like that. I don't know, does anybody else in the room know? It's a good question. Yeah.
I would think they would slow, but I wouldn't think they would reverse course once they start flowering, but that's just guess.
Yeah.
Keep
Might
watching.
slow, but.